ask Allah that He makes this gathering of His remembrance, and that He blesses us and our parents, and He blesses our knowledge that we will gain, that we have gained, and that we are gaining. And by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, today we will begin a new book after we have finished our previous book, Usul al-Sunnah by Imam Ahmad. Today we are beginning Kitab Al Tawheed, the book of Tawheed, by Shaykh al-Islam al-Mujaddid Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, whose full name is Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab ibn Sulaiman ibn Ali. And he is from Ali Mushrik, from the tribe of Bani Tamim, Qabilat Bani Tamim al-Mashhur, the famous tribe of Bani Tamim that has gave out many of the scholars of today, those in Saudi Arabia. وإمام الدعوة السلفية في نجد وغيرها. And he is the Imam, he is the Imam of the spreading and the call to the Salafiyah, to that, the manhaj, the methodology of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and what his companions and those who followed his companions and those who followed them, what they, radiyallahu anhum wa rahimahumullah ajma'een, what they were upon. And Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he was born in the year 1115 of the Hijrah, after the Hijrah. He was born in the year 1115 Hijri, being after the Hijrah. And he was born at a time when there was a lot of shirk, a lot of polytheism, a lot of bid'ah, innovations, a lot of that was being spread about. Even you'd see in places such as Medina, domes and big buildings built upon the graves. And it was spread everywhere. Everywhere you would go, you would find people practicing these types of shirk, these types of polytheism. But by the will of Allah, he rahimahullah, Shaykh al-Islam, he identified the haqq and he was upon it. And not only was he upon it, rather he made a pact between himself and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to spread it. And by doing so, he wrote this blessed book, this great book, Kitab Al Tawheed, the book of Tawheed. And he did so to spread it to the people. Spread the idea of Tawheed, to get rid of the ideas of polytheism, of shirk, and to get rid of the bid'ah and the innovations that have came along. And by doing so, many of the people have gone against it. Whenever you bring up the name Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, their hairs stand up and they start to think, who is this guy? And they say he came 300 years ago. And they start to call you a Wahhabi and this and that. But the people that call us and call people Wahhabis, they have never picked up a book of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Never mind read it. And not only has he published this book, Kitab Al Tawheed, he's published many others, such as Al-Usul al-Thalatha, and many like them, to stop these innovations and to show what the methodology of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is, and to push away the shirk, the polytheism, and the bid'ah, the innovations. He rahimahullah, he begins this book by saying Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most forgiving. And he does this because, as we see in the Quran, some of the scholars have said that it is a sunnah to do this. To start what you do, any event, anything you say, with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Because every surah in the Quran, apart from Surah At-Tawbah, begins with that. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he used to begin his letters with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most forgiving. And we know the Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, when he sent out his letter, to the queen of Sheba, the queen of where Yemen was, Sheba, where Yemen was, and going into Ethiopia, when he sent out that letter, he sent it out, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most forgiving. So if one begins an event, or he begins a letter, or he begins any type of message, it is better to begin it with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most forgiving. And here, rahimahullah, he begins the first chapter without giving it a name. Rather, he goes straight into the ayat and the evidences. And the thing that you will see with this book is that Shaykh al-Islam, he didn't write much of his own words. If you added up all of his own words, it may come up to a page or two at most. But all of it is more in the style of Imam Bukhari or Imam Muslim, where they compile evidences and of Quran, ayahs, verses from the Quran, and ahadith, narrations from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And rather than it being him speaking at you, it is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it is testimonies from the Salaf as-Salih, from the companions, from the Tabi'een, from the Tabi'at Tabi'een. It is their testimonies and the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he begins it without giving it a title, and some of the scholars have begun it and did give it a title, calling it Babun Bayan Wujub al-Tawheed, the chapter of showing the obligation of Tawheed. And before we begin with the ayahs, we must understand what Tawheed is. And Tawheed is singling Allah out in worship, that being Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. And whenever Tawheed is mentioned, the Tawheed that is mentioned, that is referred to, is Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, the oneness of worship. And every verse and hadith that the Shaykh rahimahullah brings is clarifying the obligation of Tawheed in this bab. And Tawheed is split into three types. The first of them being Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, the oneness of lordship, believing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He creates and He destroys, that He has the power to create everything and to destroy everything, that on the day of judgment it will be Him alone. He is the King of the day of judgment, that He is the one that feeds you, clothes you, allows you to breathe, allows you to be alive, that He is the one that causes the water to flow and the sun to rise and for it to set. This is Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. And Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, why whenever we speak about Tawheed we don't mean Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, is because the mushrikeen of Quraysh, for example, the polytheists of Quraysh at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they had Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. They believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They believed that He created and He destroyed and that He was the God. But rather they didn't have the second of the Tawheed, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, the oneness of worship. And many of the mushrikeen, many of the polytheists, and many of the religions, they have Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. The Christians, the Jews, they believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they believe that one God creates and destroys and does all of this, and that He's unique in His creation and His destruction and everything He does, unique in His actions. But what they fail to do is single Him out in worship, and that is what Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah is, the oneness of worship. Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, the oneness of worship, is to single Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. وحده لا شريك له. Him alone with no partners. Because he is the only one worthy of worship. And this whole book is dedicated to that. Showing tawhid al-uluhiyyah. Showing the oneness of worship. And tawhid al-uluhiyyah itself, the oneness of worship itself, it brings in tawhid al-rububiyyah. Because to worship out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, you must understand His attributes. And you must understand His power and His uniqueness. And that is the reason we worship Him out alone. Because He has told us to do so due to His power and His mighty. And His glory. And Him being unique in His attributes has allowed us to worship Him alone. So when we refer to Tawheed, we mean Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. That brings in Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, and it also brings in the third part of Tawheed. Tawheed al-Asma' was-Sifat. The oneness of the names and the attributes. And that is the 99 names of Allah and the attributes of Allah. That He is the most forgiving, He is the most merciful, as we have stated. That He is the one who brings rizq. He is the one that brings goodness to the people. He is the one that supplies everyone with everything. That He subhanahu wa ta'ala is above His throne. That He subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks. That He subhanahu wa ta'ala hears. That we will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is Tawheed al-Asma' wa-Sifat. Believing in the attributes and the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this all comes under Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. Because if one worships out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on his own, then he understands the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he understands His attributes and he understands His names. And a lot of people, they speak about these three types of tawheed. They say Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah made them, rahimahullah. Or Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab made them, rahimahullah. They made them. These are innovations, bid'ah. Rather, the three types, they originate from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ar-Rububiyyah, from the word Rabb, from the word Lord. Lordship. He is the Most High. Surah Al-Fatiha, you have it. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Rabbil Alameen. Tawheed al-Rububiyyah in front of you. Then Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, coming from the word Uluhiyyah, coming from the word Ilah, Lord. Again, Rabb and Lord. Rabb and Ilah being used. Ilah being God. Meaning to single him out. Again in Surah Al-Fatiha, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask help for. Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah in front of you. And Tawheed al-Asma' wa-Sifat. Again, the Asma' wa-Sifat, the names and the attributes, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has told us about them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us about His names and His attributes. And again in Surah Al-Fatiha, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the most forgiving, the most merciful, the most forgiving names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in front of you. And these three types of tawheed come from the Quran and the Sunnah. For they are not creations of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah or Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, rather they have been split up to make it easier for the people to understand. But they all derive from the Quran and the Sunnah. And this is what anything of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, everything they do derives from the Quran and the Sunnah. And nothing has been made up by themselves. None are innovations like that of other sects and Ahl al-Bid'ah and the people of innovation. So getting into the book, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he begins by saying, وَقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى. وَقَوْلِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. The word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. That I have not created the jinn and mankind except to worship me. And he uses this ayah in the beginning to show the importance of tawhid. To show that our creation itself, our purpose, the reason we are here, the reason why we are living is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To worship Him. Not to see who can get the biggest house or the most money or the fastest car. Not to live experiences. Not to be happy. Not to be in pursuit of that. Rather, it is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To sacrifice ourselves and our lives to Him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the meaning of ibadah, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he mentions this in his book of worship, and he says that ibadah is a comprehensive name, ismun jami'un, lima yuhibbuhu Allahu wa yardahu, that entails everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves, everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves and He is pleased with. من الأقوال والأعمال, from the sayings and the actions. الباطنة والظاهرة, that which is hidden and that which is shown. Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He loves for someone to make dua to Him. Being the batin, making someone believing in La ilaha illallah is batin as well, is hidden. It's in his heart. He believes it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves it. One, to do qiyam al-layl, to stand in the night worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. That is from the hidden ones, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves it. And a zahir, one to give to the needy. The people can see you giving to the needy. One to go to the masajid, people can see you in the masajid. These are the ones that are seen. And the aqwal, for someone to preach the da'wah, the call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the call to tawhid. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves that. So this is what ibadah is. Worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in both saying and doing. So if one says La ilaha illallah, then he goes and he prays to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's not proper ibadah. That is not singling out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in worship. He is not, whether he says it by his tongue 100,000 times. La ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah. If he goes and he prays to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he's not worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the way. And there again, if a person, he doesn't do these fi'l, he doesn't worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he negates the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says something against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not said about himself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said something about himself, and he doesn't believe in it. Then that is not proper ibadah. That is doing something by the fi'l, doing something by your actions and saying something else. Or he says something that goes against the sunnah, that is going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is not proper ibadah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us only to worship Him. Worship Him alone. Not with anybody else, not with partners. Not worshipping Him and worshipping fulan, worshipping that person, worshipping that grave, worshipping that tree, worshipping that rock, worshipping the sun, worshipping the moon. He's created us to worship Him alone. That is what is meant by لِيَعْبُدُونَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, only to worship Him. worshipping him alone, not with anybody else, singling him out in worship, and he singles himself out to the people. And he refers to the jinn and the ins, the jinn and mankind, because those are the two creatures that he has created with free will. And putting the jinn first because they were the first of the creation, being before, first of the creation with free will, being before the humans. Because we know when mankind was created, when Adam, our father Adam alayhi salam was created, who was there to go against doing sujood to him? Iblis. And he was from the jinn, unlike what many of the people think from the ideas they've got from the Christians and many others, that he was an angel that's fallen. No. He is a jinn who was raised to the level of the angels. But he was still a jinn with free will. So he could say, I do not do sujood. I do not do sujood to prayer. So the jinn were created before, and then mankind. And just like you have mankind who go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have the jinn that go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Iblis, the shayateen, the devils. And just like you have people who are righteous and they are good to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have jinn that are good to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have Muslim jinn, those who submit themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Will they go to Jannah?
Allah A'lam. You have Muslim jinn, like the ones of Sulaiman alayhi salam, those who did his bidding, those who followed him, who followed his word. So you have Muslim jinn and you have non-Muslim jinn. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created both the jinn and the mankind to only worship him. Meaning that he refers to all that has free will, all that can do their own thing, that can make their own choices, referring to them to worship him alone. Because the angels, we know they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they have to. They have no will. But the jinn and the ins, the jinn and humankind, they can have will. And they can choose not to worship Allah, or they can choose to follow the purpose that they were sent down to do and follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then here rahimahullah he says وَقَوْلِهِ وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنِ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ. That I have sent down, he says in the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that I have sent down with every nation a messenger. And the command of worshipping Allah and staying away from the taghut. So how does this ayah show that tawhid is wajib? The taghut, it shows that tawhid is wajib because it shows, if we look at the first bit, and i'budullah, says to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning to worship him alone. That tawheed is wajib because he has sent it to every nation, meaning the one thing that they all have in common, because there was different rulings to different nations. Some nations were allowed to drink alcohol, some nations were allowed to have a certain amount of wives, this and that. But one thing that stayed the constant, that stayed the same, and every single messenger brought this, and he brought it first, was the call to tawheed. From Adam alayhi salam all the way to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he came with the call of tawheed. Nuh alayhi salam, he came with the call of tawheed. All of the prophets came with the call of tawheed. And this shows that tawheed is wajib, it's obligatory upon a person. So much so that every single prophet came with this, showing the greatness of it. That it must be spread to every single nation, whatever nation it is, it must be spread to them. Because it is the most important of the things, singling out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in worship, and worshipping Him alone. And then it says, وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتِ, avoid the taghut. And the taghut is everything that a servant passes beyond its limit, causing transgression. Meaning that they put them higher than their status, causing a person to go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether it is something or someone that is worshipped or obeyed. So if it's someone that is obeyed and worshipped, for example, certain people worship and obey awliya or shuyukh, certain shuyukh, they obey them and listen to them. Or things, for example, they worship stones or rocks or trees. Or they worship statues and idols. Or like in the time of the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, some worshipped suns, the sun and the moon and fire. Or some worshipped idols and statues. All of this is taghut. And if it is human, if the taghut that being worshipped is human, then that human must be pleased with their worship. Like Fir'aun, he told the people worshipped him. Why? Because he told them. And when they worshipped him, he felt good. He didn't tell them, don't worship me. Rather, he was pleased with their worship. Or for example, Isa alayhi salam, would he be classed as a taghut? No. Because he wasn't pleased with the worship. He isn't pleased with the worship because he called to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So worshipping him would go against that. So he wouldn't be classed as a taghut. And this ayah, this verse connects to the chapter of showing tawhid, as it shows that all of the prophets were united upon one thing. That being tawhid. And that being the call to tawhid and calling to the oneness of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then here, rahimahullah, he says, وَقَوْلِهِ. You see that it's all verses. All words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing from him yet. And he says, وَقَوْلِهِ. And him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. And this shows the obligation of tawheed. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, qawa, is a command, a judge. When he is in the court, yaqdi, he commands, he orders. And just like that, the judge of judges, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has ordered the people to worship him alone. And then you have negating and affirming. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he negates when he says, أَلَّا تَعْبُدُ, not to worship, he negates that. And then he affirms, إِلَّا إِيَّهُ, apart from him. And it's clear, it shows that nobody should be worshipped except him. It shows clearly that nobody should be worshipped except him. And then he subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. That be good to your parents. So وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّهُ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordered not to worship except him. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, and be good to your parents. Showing the obligation of listening to your parents. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts the order of tawheed first. Meaning that from the actions, that is the most important thing, tawheed. Worshipping him. That is the most important. Out of all the actions, salah, following your parents, everything. That is the most important thing. But he then puts with it, وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. They're being good to your parents. So not only does it show the importance of Tawheed, and Tawheed being the most important thing, but it shows that you must be good to your parents as well. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts it alongside it. And just as He has commanded us with Tawheed, He has commanded us to respect and follow our parents. But He puts it in this order to highlight the importance of Tawheed. And highlight that out of all the actions, that is the most important one. Then He rahimahullah says, وَقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا. To worship Allah and not associate partners with Him, not associate anything with Him, not associate partners with Him. And this, in the previous ayahs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to worship Him, worship Him, worship Him, worship Him alone. He gives the command. But now He tells us what to stay away from. وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا. Not to associate partners. So what should you do? Worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And what should you avoid? Worshipping anybody else. And shay'a, the use of the word shay'a, anything, is vast. In the Arabic language, when shay'a is used, it is vast. It's not specifying it to a certain limit. To this. No. It's saying every single thing. Whatever your mind can think of that can be worshipped, more than that. Everything. Apart from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It shows the level that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be worshipped. And it shows how great Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and it shows how the call to Tawheed should be, how important the call to Tawheed is, and how important Tawheed itself is. And a lot of people, they don't understand the importance of Tawheed. When Tawheed is being spoken about, they do other things, they don't really listen to it. They put it to the side. If it was another topic, something that's going on now, they'd listen and they'd be attentive. What's going on? What's doing this? Or if it's another Islamic topic, if it's salah, this or that, they'd be listening, attentive. But when it comes to Tawheed, they think, I know this, I know La ilaha illallah, I know that I should worship Allah alone. But a lot of people, they say they know this, and they truly don't. Now, Sheikh Abdul Razzaq al-Badr, he says a story that he was one time sitting in a mosque, and he was sat next to a person, and this person was emotional in their dua, making dua, and he started to get emotional as well. But in the end of the dua, the man called upon other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However emotional this dua was, he called upon other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the Shaykh, he went up to him and he said, he started speaking to him nicely, and he gave him the evidences to worship Allah alone and to make dua to Him alone, and all these evidences. And he says to him, have you heard what I have said? أسمعت. Have you heard what I said? And the man says, yes, I have heard. And then he says, وَمَا رَأْيُكَ فِيهَا. What is your opinion on it? And he said, can I have an opinion when you have gave me the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? Can I say anything? And then the Shaykh said, أَسْمِعْتُ. Again, he repeats to him, have you heard? Afwan, he repeats to him, مَا رَأْيُكَ. He repeats to him, what is your opinion? And the man says, as I have said to you, I believe in them. So he said to him, so why did I hear you calling to Allah? He says, where I am from, we are not taught tawhid. We are not taught what you've said. So however much a person thinks they know tawhid, and they know this, they never know. They might be down the wrong path. They might have been told different things about La ilaha illallah. And as we will read in this book when we go through it, there are many things that a person would not think this is shirk. One of the Sahaba, and the Shaykh will use this hadith, he will use this quote, and he says that shirk, that minor shirk, is like a black ant on a small pebble in the middle of the night. Imagine that. Imagine how small an ant is. And how small a pebble is. And that ant is on a black pebble. So the background is black and the ant itself is black. In the middle of the night. Pitch black darkness. Meaning you can't see anything and you can't see the ant. And the minor shirk is like that. Is so hidden and so hard to see. So a person, even if he thinks he knows La ilaha illallah, he must understand it. He must sit and listen, because he never knows. He never knows. He might be down the wrong path. Might be thinking other ideas. And bi-idhnillah, we will continue with the last of the ayahs that Shaykh al-Islam says in this chapter, and then he goes on to state 2 hadiths. We will continue with this in the next lesson. I ask Allah that He blesses us, and He blesses this gathering, and He blesses the knowledge that we have gained and the knowledge we will gain, and that He allows us to see the next lesson and to provide it. هذا وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.